everyone. Thank you for being here. I wanted to begin by asking a really broad and general question that I don't expect you to be able to answer, or necessarily myself at this point, but that is, what is childhood? And I think as humans, we all have an innate understanding of what childhood is. In any language, in any place, if you ask someone to tell them a story of your childhood, you'd be able to do so, and everyone would kind of understand that stage in life that you're talking about. But the problem is that understanding has to remain unspoken, because as soon as you start to articulate in words what childhood is, variance in time and space comes to the forefront, and it's really hard to agree on anything in that discourse. So the term child wasn't defined in international discourse until 1989, with the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which I will call the CRC. This treaty defined a child as anyone under the age of 18. Now, this definition is quite problematic for a lot of reasons that have been covered in works outside of the scope of this paper. But I just wanted to do a comparative with you. If you look up child in the Oxford English Dictionary, which is a pretty primary source for looking up words in English, you get entries such as an infant, a young boy, youth of any sex, man without reference to age, an immature adult, and the list goes on. So what I wanted to say here is that childhood in words can mean anything, from an immature adult to an infant to someone under the age of 17. So what I wanted to look at in this paper is, how was childhood conceived of in international discourse before the CRC, before 1989, when there really was not any verbal articulation of what childhood meant? And to do this, I wanted to look at UNICEF. I'm sure you've all heard of UNICEF in varying capacities. They are the primary agency that has dealt with children since the organization's inception in 1946. So my argument will be that the conceptual ambiguity of childhood has allowed UNICEF to narrow its policy aims, moving from this broad conception of childhood to a more narrow conception of childhood that really only focuses on children under the age of 5. And I offer that this movement happened because of what I call the depoliticization of childhood. UNICEF wanted to move childhood outside of a realm that could be politically argued against. And the two things that I will frame this in today is the Cold War and the shift from public to private donor funding. So I'm going to skip over, just because of time, the first 15 years of UNICEF's tenure as an organization. They were established by the UN post-World War II to help with rehabilitation efforts, mostly in Europe. When they became a permanent agency in 1953, they started focusing more on the developing world and child health purposes generally. But UNICEF didn't really come into its own until 1960. And this is what UNICEF calls their first developmental decade, first of 3. So today I'm going to be talking about the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s as these 3 developmental decades. And 1960 is also the first time when UNICEF as an organization put forth an explicit conception of what they thought childhood was. And to them, it was what they called the whole child. Now, this is really ambiguous, and it's very vague and doesn't mean much, but they tried to articulate it a little bit more clearly. They said it deals with 4 cruxes of childhood in a comprehensive way. So they talk about nutrition, health, family, and education. And the whole child also goes from the embryo to adolescence. It covers all stages. And this was really the brainchild of the first executive director of UNICEF, who is named Maurice Pate. At this point, UNICEF was kind of a one-man show, and that's simplifying a little bit too much, but for the purposes of this presentation, whatever Pate wanted, UNICEF kind of followed. So Pate put forth this whole child conception. Now, unfortunately, Pate's health started declining in the early 1960s. He did handpick a successor, which is rather odd for an international institution, but that's, again, outside of the scope of this paper. But it's indicative of his importance to UNICEF. So he handpicked Henry Lebois to succeed him, and he called him a kindred spirit. He was hoping that the new executive director would really sort of take UNICEF in the way that Pate had started the organization. Unfortunately, it didn't quite go this way when Pate died in 1965. Almost immediately after Pate's death, the executive board, which is different than the executive directorship, submitted a report called UNICEF in Transition that said, quote, "People who have made a serious professional study of child development know that each phase of a child's life has its special characteristics and needs. 2 developmental periods are particularly important. One is early childhood and the other adolescence. This year, our executive board directed its attention to the earlier developmental period and addressed itself to the problem of how to reach the young child." Now, this report shows 2 things, in my opinion. First, it's indicative of the power shift in UNICEF. In 1965, UNICEF goes from this executive directorship-oriented organization, one man's dream and one man's whole child conception, to the executive board really taking the reins and the leadership, which means it's going to diffuse power a little bit here. The other thing it does is it's the first shift in discourse from this whole child conception that UNICEF has been putting forth to a more compartmentalized view of childhood. Without defining their terms, the report says that young children and adolescents need more attention than other children. Then the report, interestingly, summarily disregards adolescents and focuses on the young child. Now, they don't say why they do this, but I'm going to offer the Cold War context as a possible reason why. By the 1960s, Western policymakers had already made troubling connections between youth and communism. These weren't without merit. For a lot of communist intellectual history, the leaders had been putting forth things like youth are what is needed for true communist countries, communist youth leagues, things like that. So youth conjured up a controversy between the East and West during this Cold War period. Now, those of you who know Cold War history, which might not be many of you, and there's no problem with that, you might think this point is moot because Stalin actually pulled the Soviet bloc out of most UN organizations, including the World Health Organization, but he didn't pull the Soviet bloc out of UNICEF. So pretty much the only organizations of any note that the Soviet bloc was in was UNICEF and the Post Office, the UN Post Office. I could not find any reasoning that was in any archives available to me, not in Russia, about why they stayed in UNICEF, but I think that its role in youth and childhood might have something to do with it. But the point is the Soviet bloc had sufficient numbers on the 26 the executive board had 26 members, and there was quite a few of them would be on the Soviet bloc. So perhaps they couldn't make policy, but they could definitely block other people's, the Western bloc's policies from going through. So this put UNICEF in a precarious position, right? Because you're going to have the US and the USSR both wanting to influence pedagogical and vocational policies in very different ways and block the others' policies as well. So I think that the best option might have been to just remove youth from the table and focus on young children that both sides of this ideological war really couldn't oppose, saving the lives of young children. So when you entered the 1970s, you kind of had this two iterations of childhood coming from UNICEF. You had the public perception, which was still Pate's, of this whole child, holistic conception of childhood. But under the surface, with the executive board, you had these rumblings that maybe we are going to start focusing on younger children and sort of push this risky, politically loaded adolescence thing out, outside of policy. So as you moved into the second developmental decade, these two would kind of come to a head, and one of them would have to prevail. So the meta-narrative of the 1970s, UNICEF's second developmental decade, is global economic crisis, as you all know. This really weakened nations' ability to provide social benefits domestically and abroad. Severe drought, particularly in the West African Sahel, exacerbated this problem. And to put it simply, children around the world were starving. So in 1974, UNICEF declared an emergency for children. And this emergency framework really crippled the whole child conception of childhood, because while it's laudable to focus on family and community aspects of childhood, they seem secondary to more primary needs of feeding children, especially when a lot of them need food, especially at this point. Also around this time, UNICEF began publishing annual reports. I'm not sure if you've come across them in your scholarship, but they kind of have a mission statement and then they highlight policies from the previous year. The first three reports are full of references to the whole child. But by the time you reach 1974 and the peak of this emergency framework, the peak of this economic crisis, you're getting the annual reports to publicly and explicitly assert that they're giving priority to children aged 0 to 5. And by 1976, all rhetoric of adolescence has essentially fallen out of these reports. So what events correspond to this narrowing shift in the public perception, or the public conception of childhood that UNICEF is putting out? Obviously, the emergency framework had something to do with it, but that was short-lived, and I really think that if the policies continued, so we need to look at other things that happened at this point to say why young children continue to be the focus of UNICEF's policies. And one thing that happened during the 1970s is a shift in financial support. So UNICEF funds other agencies with member dues. But for some reason, UNICEF does not get member dues. They have to be voluntarily funded by UN member states. And obviously, during financial crises of this time, state discretionary budgets, which would fund organizations like UNICEF, were the first to get cut. So UNICEF actually saw a dip in the percentage of its funding from member states. So it first fully funded UN organizations, and other NGOs like Save the Children picked up the slack, and UNICEF's bottom line was not going down. But they did note in a lot of interoffice memorandums that we need to find an alternative source of funding, because if this financial crisis continues, the UN and NGOs are also going to see a dip in funding, which means our bottom line would get hurt. So together with the UN in 1979, UNICEF organized the International Year of the Child. Now, we get these all the time. I think there was one last year for Ebola, but this was the first worldwide televised concert with a bunch of the big rock stars of the age to try to raise money for the plight of children and for UNICEF, and it worked very well. Private donations doubled that year and have continued to increase ever since. So UNICEF seemingly had found this alternative way to fund their policies. But what it did is you enter the third and final developmental decade, is this shift to donor funding really cemented young children at the heart of UNICEF's policies. So in 1980, following this Year of the Child, UNICEF launched a two-prong operation called Adjustment with a Human Face. Their point of this policy was to change UNICEF's mission to really focus on humanity and not politics. The first prong of this was to have UNICEF become the leader of this grand alliance of children. But to become a leader, they really had to be the leader of donations as well. You need to have the money if you're going to lead an organization. So they started focusing on what they called GOBI. Now, this is nutritional growth, oral therapy, breastfeeding, and immunization, all of which deal with young children are meant to decrease infant mortality. So why the emphasis on infant mortality? Well, this galvanizes donors. First of all, it's a great policy in and of itself. No one can argue that we shouldn't save the lives of children, but it has these other consequences as well. For example, it's really easy to document. The 1990 annual report said oral therapy saved 750,000 lives last year. I mean, that stands out. It comes right in your face. You get the point of it. Statistics concerning adolescents are a lot harder to relay to the public. For example, there can't be a quantification, or I'm sure an economist has tried, an easy to understand quantification that says, this is what happens when a child goes to school versus balancing that with contributing to family income and things like that. So second, infant mortality galvanizes donors. For example, in 1990, the annual report said more than 100 million children will die during the 1990s, half of them from 3 common diseases which could be treated or prevented for a few cents per child. Now, this provides a direct link between donor money and saving the lives of children. It also comes with a poignant visual iteration that we've all seen of the dying child. 50 cents a day saves the life of this child. But this all wouldn't be possible without a focus on young children and these really concrete statistics. And finally, I think child mortality provides a tragic but convenient reality because the child mortality will never be solved. It's a problem, children will always be dying of something. So really it gives UNICEF this inherently noble yet Sisyphean task of ameliorating child mortality. So by the end of the 1980s, you had UNICEF firmly focusing on children under the age of 5. Then you get the passing of the CRC in 1989, which everyone thought would change child rights discourse. But it really didn't unless you're hanging out in legal circles. I think UNICEF's conception of childhood has continued to prevail. And in fact, UNICEF has further narrowed their conception of childhood by endorsing the 1,000 Days campaign, which focuses on the first 1,000 days of a child's life from conception. So really it's 0 to 3 years now that UNICEF is focusing its policies. And I think the ability of the young child to disempower ideological arguments and galvanize donors will continue this narrowing, or at least keep UNICEF's policies aimed at very, very young children. So to conclude, first I want to be very clear that UNICEF's programs have saved the lives of millions of children and helped better the situations of many more. I don't think anyone can criticize UNICEF's mission of saving this young child. You may be able to, criticize the general ethos of international institutions and things like that, but you're not going to criticize UNICEF's mission. So my argument in the paper is that this depoliticization of childhood worked. Everyone appreciates UNICEF for what it is, and we don't deal with these political issues that had been important in the past. So why is this important to us now? I think that UNICEF's narrowed conception of childhood only accounts for a very small segment of what we all consider childhood. Moreover, their narrowed mission has been obfuscated, both by the institution itself and by the lack of public awareness of what they do as an institution. For example, the first line of UNICEF's current mission statement says that the organization is the driving force that helps build a world where the rights of every child are realized. And I think it's been quite some time since UNICEF actually fought for the rights of every child, if it ever did. By not being clear about their policy goals, UNICEF's members have concealed a glaring hole in children's rights discourse, namely policies that concern adolescents. So throughout its tenure, of course, UNICEF has had some policies aimed at older generation or older segments of children, but the agency's reason for existence has been self-fulfilled as helping the increasingly younger child, which leaves the majority of children without an advocate in the international realm. Thank you.
This statement is from Literacy Day 2014 in September. Every September is designated Literacy Day. I'm going to talk about literacy as a human rights issue. Through the United Nations Education, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNICEF, literacy is proclaimed as a human right. It has been recognized as such over 50 years in several international conventions and international declarations. Human rights enables lives to flourish and are universal, inalienable, and interrelated rights to which all human beings are entitled. It can bring success and prosperity to entire communities. Further, it allows people to engage with their own societies and with our collective global community. Being literate means being able to connect the dots to who we are and what we can become. It means being able to connect the dots of learning between what we hear, read, and see. In 2010, UNESCO, issued, I'm sorry, UNICEF, excuse me, UNESCO, oh, these acronyms, UNESCO issued this statement: literacy for all is at the heart of basic education for all and is essential for achieving the goals of eradicating poverty, reducing child mortality, curbing population growth, achieving gender equity, and ensuring sustainable development, peace, and democracy. Steve Axman adds that millions of adults and children who are illiterate are victims of discrimination. Their basic human rights are being violated. That said, here are some startling statistics that make the strong case for promoting literacy for all. 776 million people worldwide cannot read or write. Put another way, 16% of the world's population is illiterate. In terms of gender specific, 2 of every 3 of all illiterate people is female. Almost 75% of the world's illiterate adults are found in only 10 countries. These are India, where 287 million adults cannot read or write. This represents 39% of all illiterate adults worldwide. Further, this figure represents 4 times the population of all of France. The other countries where 75% of the world's illiterate adults are found, and in no particular order: China, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nigeria, Ethiopia, Egypt, Brazil, Indonesia, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Here then are the most depressing figures. There are over 122 million illiterate youth worldwide. That is 10% of all young people worldwide, ages 16 to 24, are illiterate. 39% are boys, while 61% are girls. Sub-Saharan Africa holds the highest number of illiterate youth, with 24% of all illiterate being male, while 34% are young female. 13 African countries with the lowest literacy rate are Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, Ethiopia, Chad, Benin, Sierra Leone, Guinea, Central African Republic, Madagascar, Senegal, Democratic Republic of the Congo, and the Gambia. 67 million children between the ages of 5 and 9 worldwide do not go to school. 32 million of them are found in sub-Saharan Africa. This, according to a November 2012 article in New African, makes Africa the home of 45% of the world's out-of-school children. This 67 million represents 9% of the world's population in this age group. 53% are girls, while 47% are boys. Put another way, more girls are out of school than boys. More than 75% of children ages 5 to 9 who do not go to school live in sub-Saharan Africa and Southern Asia. 40% of these children, ages 5 to 9, live in poor countries affected by conflict. So what else keeps children and youth out of school and thus delays their opportunity to become literate? Actually, there are 4 factors that have been identified. They are, first, child labor. In sub-Saharan Africa, more than 30% of all children work. Second, illiterate and less educated parents. These parents place less value in the education of their children. Hence, the lack of an encouraging learning environment or parental support negatively influences children's performance in school. A third factor is poverty. No money for school materials, fees, and uniforms are all obstacles. In the Caribbean country of Haiti, 80% of the people live under the poverty line. Only 50% of Haiti's children go to primary schools and only 20% attend secondary schools. A fourth factor is lack of infrastructure. A large portion of children who do not go to school live in rural areas with difficult or non-existent access to school. So what is being done to address the issue of literacy for all? On September 8th, 2000, a resolution was adopted by then Secretary General Kofi Annan. The resolution yielded the title, United Nations Millennium Declaration. The committee generated 8 Millennium Developmental Goals, or MDGs, to be achieved by the target date of 2015. Secretary General Annan described these goals as people-centered, time-bound, and measurable. The goals are: Goal 1, to eradicate extreme poverty. Goal 2, to achieve universal primary education. Goal 3, to promote gender equity and empower women. Goal 4, to reduce child mortality. Goal 5, to improve maternal health. Goal 6, to combat HIV, AIDS, malaria, and other diseases. Goal 7, to ensure environmental sustainability. Goal 8, to develop global partnerships for development. So the purpose of this paper is to follow up on Goal 2, achieve universal primary education. So how's this goal being met? 5 developing regions are approaching universal enrollment. However, in sub-Saharan Africa, fewer than 2/3 of children are enrolled in primary school. The target for this goal was to ensure by 2015, children everywhere, boys and girls alike, will be able to complete a full course of primary education. Additionally, enrollment in primary education in developing regions reached 90% in 2010, up from 82% in 1999, which means more children than ever are attending primary school. In 2012, 58 million children of primary age were still out of school. Even as countries with the toughest challenges have made large strides, progress on primary school enrollment has slowed. 1 in 10 children of primary school age are still out of school as of 2012. Gender gaps in youth literacy rates are also narrowing. Globally, 761 million adults and 126 million youth aged 15 through 24 worldwide lacks basic reading and writing skills, with more than 90% of these being women. According to a report from International Literacy Day 2014, some parts of the world have seen a steady rise in literacy rates. Others have seen stagnation and remain far from the 2015 goal for cutting rate of literacy in half. There are successes. For example, in Ethiopia, the number of literate young people increased nearly 20% between 2000 and 2011. So finally, there are voices calling for a revamping of the African education system as a means of obtaining literacy for all. These voices call for the right direction in education for the African child. They contend that education for the African child must be African-centered. This is education designed to empower people. To empower people. According to Professor Mamo Muchi, who writes an article in the New African, the whole education system on the continent needs to be revamped and developed into an African-centered one. We're now in 1/4 of 2015, and progress toward Goal 2 of the Millennium Developmental Goals for Africa seem to yield little movement. Many contend that the jury is still out as to whether the post-MDGs and the MDG2 has yielded any movement toward universal primary education and is expected to come under critical scrutiny. Perhaps the voices calling for African-centered education will succeed in making literacy for all a human right. Thank you.
I'd like to thank her for laying the foundation for my paper. She's been able to reiterate the fact that a large number of children the world over work. And this is owing to parental illiteracy, poverty, lack of infrastructure, and a lot other factors. The status of children and what the society makes the children to go through in life have continued to attract the attention of scholars. The growing level of inequality and income disparity, particularly in the underdeveloped part of the world, has continued to take its toll on children. In Africa, with the costly and unwarranted wars and conflicts, the combatants have continued to recruit children into the army and use them as cannon foders. The spread of urbanization, with its attendant growth of towns and cities, and its continuous attraction for those in the rural areas, parents have continued to grow under terrible social and economic conditions. Now, I won't bore you with reading this. I conducted a survey on the rates, the kind of, the pattern and the trends, the type of child labor that occurs in Kaduna. It's a central states in northern Nigeria, in the core of northern Nigeria. And it is populated by mostly Hausa Fulani, the Bagis, and some other cultures. Now, I chose to work in metropolitan Kaduna because there are some spots in metropolitan Kaduna where you find a large number of children on the streets. A majority of them are hawking. And I chose an age range between age 10 and 15, even though during the course of the research, I wished I had chosen a lower age range. And that's informed the picture you saw earlier. These are children hawking in the streets of Kaduna. If you look at this closely, these children cannot be, they can only be between the ages of 5, 7, certainly not 10. And this is just a sample. There are millions and millions of children like this on the streets in the world. I am choosing my words so that I don't just say in Nigeria, because I know that hawking children are found in some other African states or nations. This is a map of Nigeria trying to depict the location of Kaduna. This is the map of Kaduna State, and Kaduna is also in the heart of the state. And that's why perhaps the seat of government is in Kaduna. I worked in Hauwa'u. People who have visited northern Nigeria, Hauwa'u is a popular area that houses one of the major motor parks in Kaduna. And you find plenty of children on the streets or in the motor parks, hawking one thing or the other. I also chose Mondo. Mondo Park area is another popular park where you find people transiting from one part of the north to the south always converge. And so you find another large chunk of children hawking one thing or the other. I also chose Ungwansariki. Ungwansariki, again, is another place that also houses another big park for people traveling to the northeastern part of Nigeria. Then I also worked in I also worked in the central market. It's called Central Market. It's popularly called Central Market, but it's the Sheikh Gumi Market that is situated in the heart of Kaduna. And you find people from all walks of life are going to that market to buy one thing or the other. So these are the areas I concentrated on. I use both quantitative and qualitative data, and for qualitative data, I did a purposive sampling procedure because I wanted to focus on the girl child who was hawking on the street. So the choice of my sample was purposive. However, for quantitative data, I did a random sampling thing, making sure that anybody in Kaduna on the street and in any of these areas stands to be interviewed, because I wanted a convenient sample where I can easily get the number that I wanted. Now, majority of the people interviewed were Hausa Fulani, because majority of the people you find hawking, again, are either Hausa people or Fulani people. This is not to say that we don't find pockets of the other dialects on the streets. Now, the majority of them have no form of education at all, while some of them have Quranic education. For the non-Muslims among them, it's a case of no education at all. The main reason for hawking were, first and foremost, parental wish. Majority of the hawkers were hawking because their parents want them to. And reasons for this was generally that they needed to hawk to get suitors, as well as make money with which the parents will buy the Kiah, which means the things the girl will need to take to her husband's house, ranging from beds, chairs, cooking utensils, and food items. It might interest you to know that there is this unhealthy culture that I call it unhealthy. I am Hausa myself. So I call it unhealthy because it has led to a particular trend of unhealthy rivalry among parents, where parents want their own daughters to stand out when they are going to their husband's house. So they want to buy almost everything. If even they cannot afford it themselves, they make the children to hawk to get the money for such goodies that they have to take to their husband's house. The major trend is that of high competition, as every girl on the street strives to sell more wares than the other, a trend that has resulted in various hazards. It has also led to unhealthy rivalry among parents who compete to ensure their daughters get the best wares to take to their husband's house. As for poverty, some of the girls hawk to provide food for their families, so for them, the primary aim is to be able to provide food for their families. And this, again, could be linked to the fact that majority of these parents are illiterate. Majority of them have no jobs. Majority of some of these parents have more than one wife, a large number of children, and as such, they need someone to cater for the immediate needs of the family. The hazards to which the teenage hawkers were exposed include injuries, street fights, sexual harassment, and indeed, STDs. The word STD here is used to present a mild picture, but a lot of girls on the street have ended up with HIV/AIDS. And this is because most of the time, they carry out wares that everybody has. And as such, they are unable to sell what they have. And so they find one or two or three men who will promise them to pay for everything they are carrying. The Hausa people call it zube. They take everything, and then they give you the money for the wares. And because they think they are doing you a favor, they make sexual advances. At times, there have been rape cases that have been reported. Again, I run an NGO that studies domestic violence. It's the Center for Study and Resolution of Domestic Violence. And we have come in contact with a lot of rape cases that have occurred as a result of hawking on the street. And if the girl is wise enough, she's able to identify the man, at times some cases are brought to us to intervene in. So the conclusion is this: parental wish was the main contributing factor to teenage hawking, which is a product of an unhealthy culture developed by parents, followed by poverty, another product of structural failure in the society. The paper recommends massive reorientation and structural policies to curb this monstrous cankerworm that is as deadly as any of the world's deadly diseases. Thank you.
I'm very happy to be here and honored to present my paper titled Empowering Children and Enlightening Parents, an Assessment of Child Protection Education in Rural Togo. Maybe to help some people know where Togo is. Togo is one of the 10 French-speaking countries in West Africa. And among my ongoing interests as a scholar in African American literature, I've recently focused on literary depiction of child abuse, specifically incest perpetrated against young girls. And this focus parallels well with my work as a former child protection specialist in Togo. So in these books, I've studied the central female characters, whether in Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye, Alice Walker's The Color Purple, and Sapphire's Push. We see female characters who have been victim of all this kind of incest, but have not been given the opportunity to reconstruct themselves. So similarly, children who are abused in Togo sometimes miss this opportunity to receive the needed services. So parents across Africa, and in Togo in particular, whether Christians or non-Christians, usually will invoke the fifth commandment of the Bible, which urges us to honor our parents as validation of their recurring unconditional obedience from their children. This leads some parents to misuse their power over their children because they consider them in many regards as their property, and I put property in quotation, creating the real potential for child abuse and emotional abuse. And I've started from an observation because I was working as a child protection specialist in Togo, and I felt a kind of resistance to accepting child protection measures in some areas, and this has led me to, start questioning some existing measures and trying to find out some ways that can help reduce to some levels this issue of child abuse in our countries and in the rural areas. So having witnessed many forms of child abuse and having worked as a child protection specialist in Compassion International Togo, an organization that promotes the holistic development of children, I've realized the need to empower children and enlighten parents by providing a clear definition of child abuse while also respecting and remaining sensitive to culturally sanctioned child-rearing practices and notions of parental authority. So drawing from my literary research on child abuse and my professional experience, this paper addresses the pervasive ignorance about the rights of children and certain preconceived ideologies that prevent some parents, especially in rural Togo, from accepting and availing themselves of child protection services. I will also examine ways in which global attitudes about child protection can be contextualized for parents who have always believed that children have only duties and not rights. So I have structured my presentation around three main points. So the first one, I'm talking about child protection in Togo, the strengths and weaknesses. So the second part, I'm dealing with some hindrances that prevent effective implementation of child protection in Togo. And the last part, I talk about some ways we can empower the children and enlighten the parents so that they contribute to the child protection in Togo. So over the past 20 years, the problem of child protection has become one of the greatest challenges for countries across the world, and Togo is no different. So while child abuse is a global phenomenon, it is understood differently in specific cultural contexts because of the complicated and varied global traditions surrounding the nature of child rearing. So the World Health Organization defines child abuse as, and I am quoting, all forms of physical or emotional ill-treatment, sexual abuse, neglect, or negligent treatment, or commercial or other exploitation resulting in actual or potential harm to the child's health, survival, development, or dignity in the context of a relationship of responsibility, trust, or power. So from this definition, you will see that it gives room for each society to decide what particular acts can be considered abuse and what acts cannot be considered as abuse. So in spite of such complexities, Togo has made significant strides in addressing the various obstacles that stand against the full realization of children's rights in Togo. So the Togolese government, NGOs, and other institutions are struggling to to create systems that protect children against all forms of abuse. Toward this end, Togo has undertaken significant actions to promote and safeguard the rights of children, including the ratification of strong international and regional conventions, laws and regulations concerning children and child protection, and also has taken national legislations that stand for child protection. So in spite of these existing laws and commitments and the efforts of the government as well as NGOs and national associations, studies and reports by international institutions show that child abuse is prevalent in Togo and is manifested in different forms. You know, physical abuse, psychological abuse, neglect, sexual abuse, and all the rest. So I will spare you with the statistics. So it is clear that even though the fundamental laws of our country, Togo, give many guarantees for the respect and protection of children, Togolese children are still victims of many types of abuse, and in their families, in their schools, and in their communities. So then, what can therefore account for the ineffective implementation of child protective services in Togo? And this question will lead me to the second part of my presentation, which is hindrances to effective implementation of child protection in Togo. As I said it before, the government, the NGOs, the national associations are making admirable efforts to educate parents and adults on child protection, but the message seems not to be understood, accepted, and applied. So children are abused at home by their parents, at school by their teachers, and in the community by others. Children become powerless and vulnerable before such situations. And according to the Togolese laws on child protection, for instance, caning or beating or whipping is banned in schools, but not in families. So this situation encourages, and I put encourages into quotes, many parents to abuse physically their children at home, because maybe that will not happen in schools. So adding to the reliance on caning, many parents and teachers are ignorant of other more effective alternatives for discipline. And for me, the first and foremost barrier is ignorance about child protection laws and regulations among parents, teachers, community members, and even children themselves. Many people, even though these international laws exist, the national laws exist, the legal frameworks for reporting child abuse exist, many of these people don't know them. They are ignorant of this law. The second hindrance for me is mostly related to cultural traditions. Togo, for example, like many other African countries, has inherited a culture in which caning a child for misbehavior is considered normal. Caning became part of the culture because nobody saw anything wrong with it. Parents would use this method to discipline their children because that is the way they had been raised, and they thus end up considering caning as part of their culture. But many Togolese will rightly or wrongly quote this Bible quotation that will say, spare the rod and spoil the child. And they will keep on repeating. So such ingrained culture attitudes as advocating caning create real barriers to protection of children, not because adults are cruel, but because they are repeating learned behaviors passed down over generations. Another hindrance to child protection in Togo is that many people, especially in rural areas, tend to resolve child abuse issues amicably and among themselves as a community rather than through legal procedures. So the victims in the case of child abuse, for instance, many people in rural areas would like the issue to be resolved in a friendly manner because they want to preserve the reputation of the family and of the child in the community. So this situation is even worse than, even more by the corruption prevalent in many African societies. Sometimes abusers are not punished severely because they are influential in the community or know influential people who can plead in their favor and help them go unpunished. So confronting these hindrances, one might rightly ask ask how child protection services can be made effective in Togo. And this led me to the third part of my presentation, empowering children and enlightening parents on child protection. So from the presentations that came before me, we've seen that a lot of efforts are made by international institutions like UNICEF, and these institutions are making recommendations to countries so that they will try to find solutions to the problems of child protection. So Togo also has got recommendations from the from UNICEF. But when I read these recommendations, I found out that these recommendations don't consider every aspect of the solutions. And for me, the children and parents who are the main actors and victims in child abuse and child protection should be directly involved in creating a safe environment for the holistic development of children. These recommendations usually focus on the government, on the state, and what they can do. But I think that the parents and the children need to be really involved. So the legal and political context of the country now requires a different reading of violence perpetrated against children. So the definition of child abuse offered by the World Health Organization is not easy to generalize because the realities and attitudes about violence against children vary from one culture to another. There is therefore a need to improve public access to information on child protection, child abuse, and ownership of legal instruments in force. I therefore suggest the following for the empowerment of children and enlightenment of parents on child protection in Togo. So for me, the first action that needs to be carried is to educate all children regarding child protection. Children should be made responsible and informed participants in their own protection. And another effort toward this goal is to create children clubs in schools. And these clubs should be responsible for promoting the welfare of children in schools and community. Children will then be advocating for themselves and for their protection from abuse. Apart from this initiative in schools, I believe that religious groups, NGOs, and other organizations should be proactive in their strategies to help children. They should organize informal programs to educate children on their rights and the legal procedures to report child abuse. The capacities of the children should be enhanced and their self-confidence built so that they feel equipped to report any kind of abuse they will become victim of. Additionally, parents need to be educated on the respect of the dignity and agency of children. Many parents are not cognizant of the rights of children, and that is why they are passively or actively involved in the abuse of their children. When we take the case of child trafficking, for instance, because they don't know really that it is bad, sometimes they play a passive role. When somebody promises to give them something, they will just give their child, and the child will be involved in child trafficking, for instance. So the state and NGOs should also help parents learn how to contextualize Western methods of discipline in Togolese environment. Today, however, it is very common to see many Western NGOs and child welfare organizations working with children and parents in Togo. It is common to see them discourage parents from caning their children. They tell parents that caning is considered as a physical abuse. It might even be said that they impose, I put impose in quotation 2, Western disciplinary methods on Africans. Unfortunately, these well-meaning NGOs and organizations fail to educate parents on effective alternative methods of discipline of children in the Togolese context. Before even deciding on the appropriate means of disciplining a child, the notion of child abuse needs to be clearly redefined. And for me, the Togolese contextualization of Western method of discipline involves having the child give his or her opinion in the discipline process. This means that the child is part and parcel of the process of setting rules for discipline and the penalties awaiting those who will go against the rules. Another element in the education of parents about the child protection is to set in place in all schools, religious groups and associations, the parent clubs, parent fathers club, mothers clubs that would be held responsible for promoting child protection measures. And by so doing, they will contribute greatly in solving the problem. So to conclude my presentation, I will simply say this. So when we consider Togo, as well as many African countries, we have beautiful, wonderful laws concerning child protection, concerning education of children, and all the rest. But because of some problems, and I mentioned them, ignorance about these laws and non-mastery and some cultural ingrained practices, this makes things very difficult to have child protection really implemented in our context. So these parents will play either a passive or an active role in the perpetration of abuse of children. And for me, I am thinking that the NGOs, government, religious groups, and other social institutions have key roles to play in the promotion of children, of child protection services. Parents and children should be trained and should have their capacities built on child protection and the legal framework that is appropriate for responding to child abuse. So child abuse is not a fatality. It can be reduced and even ended if each stakeholder takes responsibility for change. Because children are key to the development of a society, we need to protect them and offer them a safe space for their holistic development. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. In case of time, let me just read the summary of my paper. Modernity and development are relatively intertwined within the context of human rights and witchcraft. Even though the concept of modernity is generally perceived as advancement, arguably, it has contributed to socio-economic inequality, cultural decadence, and proliferation of witchcraft in some African societies. The aim of this paper is to examine how modernity reinforces witchcraft across African societies, especially in light of children being accused of practicing witchcraft in Eke, Akwa Ibom, Nigeria. This paper argues that the accused children's human rights have been violated as a result of witchcraft accusations in respect to modernity, especially via the modes of Pentecostalism and video film technology. Equally, these children have been displaced due to some factors, including those that are social, political, religious, and economic. Policies with respect to African traditions are encouraged in order to foster critical modernity. This paper recommends utilizing modernity as a proactive tool in incorporating African cultures in the quest for development. Okay, let's see. These are, I believe that twins, the siblings accused of practicing witchcraft in Akwa Ibom, and the second one, an accused child faced battered by her mother because a prophet accused her of killing one of her younger brothers. Could you imagine that? No. So it is really I don't know the word to describe it. It's really very unhealthy, you know. Yes, thank you. And the last one here, Waka, accused child with a brain injury. Like 6 inches, right? Neil was driven inside her brain, inside her head, and she later died of brain injury, you know, and because she was accused of practicing witchcraft, you know. So it is really, you know, I mean, I don't know. We have some videos. There are some videos on YouTube, actually. I cried the first time I presented a similar paper. So it's really, it's really bad. But let me go on. Witchcraft, like a small definition, is the belief in manifestation of supernatural powers which may be innate in a person, inherited or acquired in any of several ways. There are other definitions, but that's similar. Witchcraft accusations have been shifting from elderly, particularly women, to the children in some African societies in recent years. And the reasons why children have become the specific focus of child witchcraft allegations and human rights witchcraft accusations, which is relatively recent phenomenon, remain partially unclear, according to Hansen. These accusations predominantly come from the family members, church leaders, and prophets. And in this paper, I have argument and questions. Okay, I think I've said that before. Even though the modernity, however, one would expect the decrease of witchcraft, but in reality, modernity is reinforcing witchcraft in Africa. I mean, can you imagine that? Okay, I have 3 questions. This paper considers 3 central questions within the context of children accused of practicing witchcraft. First, how has post-colonialism contributed to witchcraft in Africa? Second one, how has Pentecostalism contributed to children being accused of practicing witchcraft? How has video film technology impacted witchcraft discourse in Africa, all within the context of human rights? And in my paper, I divided into like 4 sections. The first one is modernity within the context of folk belief system. Second one, Pentecostalism, post-colonialism, Pentecostalism and video film. Third one, the accused children and human rights issues, and the conclusion and recommendations. So let me, I still have time, right? Okay. When it comes to modernity within the context of folk belief system, several scholars have linked modernity to witchcraft by suggesting that it has magnified as a result of modernity. Modernity has impacted traditions and cultures of African societies, yet modernity has not replaced all tradition and traditional ways of knowing and perceiving, and the place of humans in it continue to be the basis of human experience. According to Peter Gershcherer, after independence, for most African states around 1960s, a belief of modernization inspired both the new African elites and the expatriates, development exports to promote rapid westernization. During that time, African values were dehumanized. So it continues up to today. Okay, now let me talk about post-colonialism. Even though there were people, including the colonial governments, missionaries, and anthropologists that have great intention and did production work in developing Africa, some of them have different agendas. Specifically, dehumanizing the people and devaluing the culture. African cultures have continued to be negatively and backwardly perceived. In colonial records, according to Peter Gershcherer, any suggestion of African ritual or celebration was associated with evil and the work of devil. Okay, Pentecostalism. Most aspects of African folk beliefs have been condemned since the arrival of the missionaries in Africa. According to Gershcherer, present-day Pentecostals and other currents in popular Christianity continue this with their questions of tradition and an omnipresent devil. To the end of the 20th century, new Christian Pentecostal churches started proselytizing, especially what? Thank you. Both demons and witchcraft in Africa. Okay, video technology. In terms of video technology, modern mass media, notable the booming video film industry, plays a crucial role in these witchcraft accusations. According to Peter Gesteret, no wonder modernity in Africa seems to reinforce witchcraft rather than weakening it. African efforts to combat witchcraft accusations have been undermined by video film, mainly Nollywood. It is not uncommon for Nollywood movies and churches to ridicule African cultures and associate them with witchcraft. This is evidenced in early missionary narratives and films made about Africa by expatriates and colonialists. They accuse children and human rights issues. Scholars, actually have indicated that little attention has been paid to child rights abuse in relation to witchcraft accusations in Nigeria. I got this, was actually documented in 2009, and I tried to get literature, but I didn't have enough when it comes to, I think, quantitative research methods, but qualitative, they're out there. Okay? And also I plan to do an action research before for my dissertation, but I was discouraged. Somebody from our appointment was like, be careful, Governor Obio, no, not in witchcraft, Governor Obio is gonna get you. Yeah. Don't go there. Actually, somebody also said, witchcraft, don't even try it. That was in a class. So, people discourage you because of that fear, Yeah. So, in conclusion, the impact of modernity reinforces witchcraft in African societies. Based on the outcome of the modernity, reinforcements of witchcraft in African societies, there are some implications that surround this paper, including human rights, economics, and development. And the recommendations? Well, I tried. This paper recommends that African cultures should be the center, as Africans try to re-articulate their culture within an African perspective. Even though some have accused some religious leaders for diagnosing the children with witchcraft, filmmakers for portraying children as witches and wizards, and government officials for not doing enough to arrest the situation, parents and family members are still remained the source of contact to the children, just like the gentleman from Togo, articulated when it comes to their knowledge in terms of human rights, right? Child's rights. So, therefore, policies to help the parents understand the notion of witchcraft should be introduced, or if in existence, be polished for effective results. And when I was actually viewing this letter, because I'm from film, I do research on film anyway, but mass media, communication, and culture. So there is this theory called cultivation theory or cultivation analysis. It says that cultivation theory states that high-frequency viewers of television are more susceptible to media messages, and they believe that they are real and valid. Heavy viewers are exposed to more violence and therefore are affected by the mean world syndrome. They believe that the world is a far worse and dangerous place than it actually is. Okay, so I was thinking about this this particular theory, and I was like, okay, trying to kind of connect it with modernity, okay? Because even here in America, according to media, theories, television is really television has really contributed even decadence when it comes to family values, and So the way I'm seeing, I'm trying to use the, since I have like 2 more minutes, so I will say this. I have using cultivation analysis. So the viewing, the atlas might be like that, modernity, right? So modernity coming to Africa, right? So the way we view modernity. So every viewer of modernity, people that embracing it, they are, they are likely see the world as the mean world syndrome. The word I might even think about could be African culture, African cultures, because that modernity will be like, oh, you humanize African cultures, because you are a heavy viewer, you just embrace it. I am not saying do not embrace it, but critically embrace it. Use African lens to know what to take, to adjust what you have, okay, what you have. When it comes to witchcraft, I think, I forgot, okay, this will be a question for everybody. Was it existing before colonialism? Did missionaries brought witchcraft concept to Africa? So think about it. So, thank you.
For young scholars, that's a good lesson. Always use that in conclusion, and then they'll never shut you down because they think you're really close to the end.
Or finally,
Huh?
or say finally.
Finally is good too, and then go on for 5 more minutes for that. So, thank you to certainly the 5 presenters for excellent panel. I had a chance to read 4 of the 5 papers. They're all very well written and very well researched as well. Let me present these certificates to you very quickly. I just have a few comments to make. I'm not going to ask any specific questions. I'll leave that certainly to you in the 13 minutes or so that we have left. Some of the common themes that I saw coming through are what is child? How do we define who is a child? Who is a youth? Very different. And oftentimes outside of Africa, we try to put these numbers on it, 0 to 5, 0 to 3, youth, up to 18. Of course, it's not possible. You're a youth until you have a job and you get married.
That's right. Even if you're 50.
Even if you're 50. Well, hopefully, yeah, if you're still living in your parents' basement. So we have to ask that question, can we, and should we actually try to define these psychological stages of life? They're not chronological stages, at least in much of the world. I think we have to look at questions such as sort of top-down. Well, first we have to look at the problems associated with childhood, with adolescence. And then we have to talk about top-down solutions, UNESCO, UNICEF, or African-centered solutions. One of the papers raised the issue of youth-centered, youth agency. Youth should take care of this problem themselves. Can they? Will they be allowed to? Because they're talking about initiating a cultural change in many cases. We're talking about generational conflict. Whenever we're talking about youth and children, it's always generational conflict as well. My 9-year-old son already knows way more than I ever will. Just ask him. He'll tell you. So there's always conflict. The generation that's older than us, we always think, yeah, that was nice then, but now we do things differently. So there needs to be some sort of interaction between generations as well. Talk about the role of education. A number of you talked about that. And not only education, but the role of schools, the role of teachers, the role of popular culture and media, such as film. And I think something that comes through pretty clearly in all the papers is the role of economics. Because it's poverty and it's the lower classes who are the ones hawking in the streets, who are the ones who maybe haven't received the education about we can do things differently, who are not literate, who maybe don't make it to 3 years old because of improper care. So those are just some of the things I'm throwing out. You don't have to embrace those at all, but those are some of the themes that, I think this is a very important panel. Obviously, youth is the future, and we need to start appreciating that more. So, questions? I will take a number of questions first, and then hopefully we'll have time for at least one response from each one.
My question revolves around the existence of the supernatural, because clearly witchcraft issues are grounded in the supernatural. People believe that these things are real. And when we look back at the African traditional spirituality, as well as African indigenous churches, These are African generated trends that have arisen to confront the Western influence on some of these domains, but still embrace spirituality and the existence of witchcraft. How does your research tackle that issue of supernatural, the presence, the existence of supernatural powers, and as projecting or influencing the definition of witchcraft?
Okay, write those down. We'll take a few more questions for those.
Directed to everybody. The other one is more specific. I will start with the one which is about critical approach. That is, most of the concepts that we use, like literacy, etc., are not defined, and in my view, need to be defined and criticized. Because, for instance, when we say that illiteracy is high in some African countries, what are we talking about is illiteracy in European languages. There are millions of Africans who speak Arabic and write Arabic, and nobody put them in the category of literate people. So that's the very first thing. So this is a very Eurocentric approach of literacy that needs to be criticized. The second one is directed to the first presenter. Your main argument is that UNICEF has contributed to the depoliticization of childhood. I tend to contend with this idea. In my view, what UNICEF has done is, on contrary, over-politicizing childhood by putting it on the global agenda. Because politics is, as I understand it, is not a matter of ruling. Politics is any action directed to a society in order to orientate the conception of what action, what participation in society means. If we take this understanding, I mean, if you agree with your understanding of politics, we would ask the question whether the gay mobilization, the black mobilization, just to take two examples, are political events. So I think that there is need to revise this idea of politics.
Okay, we'll take two more. One here and then.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, my home question as well cut across the whole presentations. My question is, how do we take this issue of child labor, or issues surrounding child's human rights beyond academic domain? And the reason why I said this is because my own dissertation too was on child labor, and most of the things discussed today was also discussed in my work. And to me, I want to believe this issue requires urgent state intervention. You see, we keep repeating the same thing. I won't be surprised if next year we'll come to this conference and you see we repeat the same thing. So I think it requires urgent state intervention. So as academics, how do we take it from beyond the academic domain to the government and see what can be done?
It's a very good question. Oftentimes conferences end and we talk about it, but where do we go from here?
I think they can hear me. Yeah.
Oh, no, but this is for the camera.
Okay, for the recording.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the recording.
It's actually about what she said is a comment, and it's also a question, and is addressed to Madam and to the last speaker. No, not exactly. Yeah. The children hawking, and then the witchcraft issue. Where do we go from here? This thing has been on, like she said, for years, and I'm sure that government knows about it. Unfortunately, the spiritual leaders that are supposed to be liberating them are the ones putting them in bondage, and they know what they are doing. They want to make money. It's all about poverty, and it's all about what they are going to make out of it. They know the truth. Unfortunately, the truth is not setting them free. So what do we do about it? Because if this conference were to be on child abuse, child labor, we'll hear a lot of these. And the following year, you come, you hear it again, and you hear it again, and you hear it again. So what exactly are we doing? I must say that there are a lot of governmental issues about this. Government has to do something. While the parents in Lagos would carry their children in all kinds of jeep every day, some people are labeling their own witches and wizards. I mean,
We have to give these
it's
people time to answer.
it's ridiculous. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for your questions. I think we have a little bit for everyone, so let's just start here with Rosalie, Kiah. Whatever you would like
Okay.
to respond to.
I don't know what I'm
1 to 2
responding
minutes.
to.
There was a question about literacy. How do we
About
define
this,
that? That
okay,
one
back
might be
there, okay.
appropriate.
All right, thank you, thank you. Okay, the good guy in the white hat,
How do you know he's a good guy?
because I know him, yes. In terms of speaking other languages other than European languages, was that one of your concerns? Okay, so I was speaking basically from the United Nations point of view. And these are all members of the United Nations, you know, European countries and African countries and that kind of thing. So I don't think that they address individual languages, I'm not sure. And it's he who pays the piper calls the tune.
Certainly, I think it goes to the top-down versus African-centered approach, though. If we let them define it, well, then of course it's going to look like the literacy rate is much lower. But if we change the definition, then we can change the results as well. Yes, definitely.
Well, I think Prof has taken care of the issue of illiteracy, but I'd like you to understand the fact that it's not a Eurocentric definition for for literacy or illiteracy. As much as possible, in northern Nigeria where I come from, if you are knowledgeable in Arabic or whatever, you are not counted as an illiterate person. So it's not a Eurocentric approach to the issue, the question of literacy. It's not just about you being able to read in English and write in English. It's about your ability to understand what goes on around you. A lot of us can read and write, but we are more illiterate than those who cannot read and write. Parents' way of exploiting kids, like I stated in my paper, there are situations of parents exploiting kids. Exploiting kids because they have to put food on the table, and the reverse is supposed to be the case. The parents should provide the food for the children and all other amenities. However, when it comes to the issue of sending your child or your daughter into marriage, it's a culture, it's a trend that has developed, which I rightly quoted as an unhealthy culture. I'm part of it. I mean, I've given out 3 of my daughters, and I've had to buy everything they were going to take to their husbands' houses. And because I had the way with her, they didn't have to hawk to get those things. But in a lot of cases, like you say, we come back and we say, this problem is there, it's always there. We come back next year and we say it is still there. I'd like you to take a look at my paper again if you have the time. I spoke about structural intervention. Structural intervention, putting in place what can be used to curb the menace. And that's the starting point. I did this study over a period of 2 years, and I can tell you that what was obtained in 2013, when I went down this road, is not what is there today. But then you will still have to report the fact that the menace is still there, and that the percentage of change in the pattern or the prevalence is not significant enough to throw it away. It's something we have to discuss over and over again until we get an answer to it. And to whether there are other factors, yes, there are a lot of other factors besides parental wish, besides exploitation or poverty. But these are the most prominent factors. And these are the ones that I think need to be addressed immediately. Thank you.
I would like to say 1 or 2 things about the questions. The first thing I want to talk about is the practicality of the theories that we've developed. And I believe that the approach should go the other way around. I think that it needs to start from the grassroots level. And for me, we need to start a change from the families, the homes. If we are waiting for the government to start doing things, it will take a long time. And I believe that if we can start changing the mindset of parents right from the homes, one at a time, can take 100 years, but it will come to a point one day. So I believe it needs to start at small levels. Just do what you can. And I said it, we need to educate, we need to contextualize, we need to tell the parents at every level, in the churches, in the communities, not expecting the government. The government will do it, but it will take time. And we encourage that one, but we need to start. And the second aspect about the definition of literacy, Eurocentric, Afrocentric, and all the rest, I really like, education to be Afrocentric in Africa, Afrocentric. And I really believe that if we can reach that level, because when you consider institutions in Africa, many institutions, almost all of them, none is Afrocentric. All of them are westernized. And I believe it needs to start changing by the mind, decolonizing the mind, and fostering self-esteem. And finally, I'm talking about the issue of mass media and the witchcraft. I believe that in the United States, here in the 17th century, there was the issue of Salem, witchcraft, and all this, we know. But today, it is a mythology. And I still believe that something needs to be done so that maybe in 300 years after, in Africa too, it will become a mythology. Thank you very much.
I know the next thing on our schedule is lunch, but the good news is lunch is a little late. So you're not missing anything yet. About 5 more minutes, and then I think hopefully we're ready up there. Let me just say one thing, too. 3 of the 5 papers had a very strong conclusion section at the end that said this is what we should do looking forward. So I think some of those have been addressed, certainly in the presentations, but also even more so in the papers. And someone like Komi has done it on the ground as well, working for, I guess it's a nonprofit, private, thank you, in Togo, dealing with child abuse. So, Kristen.
So the idea that I'm talking about depoliticization and maybe it's over-politicization. My response would be, of course, academics can define terms in various ways. So for me, I think a political issue by nature is controversial. There's different sides. Different people in the political spectrum will argue in a different way. And what I was trying to say is, by focusing on young children saving the lives of infants, there is no argument against that. That depoliticizes the issue. But that's very different from pushing it as a public policy around the world, which I think UNICEF, of course, has done by making childhood a public policy issue. That is different in my definition, and that doesn't mean either of our definitions are better. It's just why academics have to define their terms, and I think it's important to work with the term that the academic defines. That doesn't mean we can't debate them in a different setting, which I think is also important. And then just to touch on the how do we move beyond academic forums for this thing. I was not someone that tried to provide an answer necessarily in my paper. The point of my paper is, I think as academics, we often think we have all the answers. I think UNICEF people think they have all the answers. And as we've noticed, I think local conceptions and local solutions are very, very important. So part of the role of academics is to look back and point out, this might not be the perfect policy that bureaucrats keep throwing around and think is perfect in the end, or at least an effective policy. So I think the role of academics is to make institutions and people question what they're doing to try to constantly improve that. I don't think academics have the answer, and I think applied history is important but dangerous because historians don't have the answer, perhaps political science don't either. It's like the interdisciplinary nature of academia can just help point out problems and move on policy. That's my little contribution.
Witchcraft issues, like talking about Salem, Massachusetts. We are not Africans are not the same when it comes, the same people like Americans. Okay, so when we just suppose these two, peoples, those two cultures, we have to be careful because religion is ingrained in ourselves. So, and we do things religiously all the time. You see, so we have to be mindful of that, and we don't, that's why whatever we are doing, we can, let's pray, let's do this, let's do that. I mean, it's a little bit different here in America. And also, we can talk more about it. When you said, Mother, you said it's all about poverty. I mean, I just, Governor Ababio said the same, but I think it's kind of a generalization all about poverty. there are many factors. Poverty might be the dominant factor, but there are other things that contribute to child abuse, all these witchcraft issues. So, and it could be poverty of the your mind, and also because there are other people who are who are poor, like kids, but they don't their families do not abuse them. They go. A lot of children go through physical and structural harm. Okay, so the structural harm is also underlying things that we tend not to see. We tend to talk about the physical harm a lot. So, and when you talk about Afrocentricity, we're going to talk about it later. So let me give others room.